not having the courage or the practice and the humility to try and pronounce a name that was difficult to his tongue. So we're all faced with the issue of culture and how we deal with it and how we can come to terms with our history and move on and design for all cultures in New Zealand. So, first of all, how do we deal with decolonisation? First of all, I think you need to know who you are personally. Now, you've heard from Andrew some of the highlights or lowlights of my life, but something I also should make clear is that I've got both English and Scottish and Māori ancestry. So William Swanson, whose name appears in Swanson Lane and Swanson Street in a suburb further out in Auckland, was one of my great-great-grandfathers, and his wife was Māori, Annie Rangatūnoa. I started off not being aware of that at all, and so more and more I'm beginning to find that actually I identify more and more with my Māori links, but of course I'm both. So, how do we work this? I'm a technophobe. So first of all, we start with a whakapapa. So for me, that is ko kahuranaki te manga, ko toki tukui te awa, ko takatimu te waka, ko Ngāti Kahununu te iwi, ko Ngāti Whetui Apati te hapu, no ponaki ahau, ko Diane Menzies tō kuingoa. So for those of you who find that new, just to explain, and it is important for what I'm going to say later, the mountain, for me, the important mountain for Ngāti Kahununu, in this case, is Kahuranaki. The mountain is a symbol of permanence, of longevity, and so on. And the water, the stream, the river is Tuki Tuki, which again is very symbolic in that it stands for the lifeblood, the flow, the purity, and the importance for people, and of course for all life. And the waka connects me and others who are from Kahununu with other tribes that came to New Zealand on particular canoes. And I was born in Te Whanganui Atara, Horniki, Wellington. So that's a description of who I am, and the most important thing about that is that the mountain, the river, are all much more important than I am. So your name is said last. Now, first of all, I'd like to tell you a story. And this is a story that is about culture, and it is about sensitivities, and it's about people, and in Auckland. I'm a member of a small group of grannies who, every 3 months, have a meeting on karanga. Karanga is the calling, the ceremonial calling. And I might not be very good at it, but we learn, we have a lot of fun, and do a number of activities. This is the story of going to the beach last year to Point Chev. We didn't get there as early as we planned. It was meant to be a dawn greeting to the waters of the Waitemata, but we arrived a bit later. It's also a story of Nana Florence. So the karanga ladies were walking into the sea, and gradually the tide went down, and we swam, and we thoroughly soaked ourselves and enjoyed the beach in November. And then one of our members heard some others, and by that stage the beach was fairly crowded and kids were in swimming and the sun was shining. One of our members heard a group of people arriving who had a box of ashes. And they were very upset and were talking about what they would do with the ashes. They had waited 18 years to take the ashes of Nana Florence from New Plymouth to where she wanted to be left at Point Share, because in her childhood she had a wonderful time, wonderful memories of Point Share Beach as a child. And so we wondered what would happen, and our whaia, our senior karanga person, had a word to the family and explained that right behind the beach there was a beautiful kahutikawa tree, in fact several, and just as she was pointing it out, a whole lot of wood pigeons flew out of the tree. And so we suggest, what if Nana Flo's ashes were put under the tree instead of in the beach where everybody was swimming? And the family thought that was a good idea as well. And we took Nana Flo up to underneath the tree, and we sang a hymn, and we had a prayer, and the ashes were scattered. And a few days later, one of our group who took care of the pāharakeke at Unitec came and planted young flax plants around the bottom of the tree. So that addressed a subject that was difficult to us, very difficult to the family. They were in tears when they arrived. They didn't know quite what to do and how to do it. And some might say, well, there's quite a lot of pollution in the sea anyway, and does it matter? To me, it mattered, maybe to others as well. And so that was a way of moving together and finding an outcome that everybody could live with, that the family could live with it as well, and they departed looking much happier than they had when they arrived. So the story of Nana Florence is one of, in our terms, and I think in their terms as well, compassion and understanding and having new growth under the pūtikawa trees. But that wasn't the only thing that happened on this very same day. Many other things happened. We went up to Waitakaris. We went up to the dock. Is it a hut? It's not a hut. It's a information centre designed by Harry Turbot there that sits beautifully into the forest. And from there we karangaed from the veranda down to the dam, the Hunua Dam that's down below. And we thought we saw the dam responding and the water rippling with the sounds, the vibrations. And we went into the forest as well in the Waitakaris and did the same thing. And again, we felt that the birds were responding. Some of the others who were tourists who were arriving may not have understood what was happening. But I guess the message that I want to leave with you from this is that we need to be sensitive to cultural values. And when we're living in a city where we're living close together, we need to try very hard to understand those that we're living with. We may not understand, but we can work at it. Oops. I did say I was a technophobe. There we go. So, before we discuss decolonisation, I think we really need to look at, so what is colonisation? What's it all about? Why is it of any moment at all in New Zealand? I was told by somebody that I've got to tell a story and I've got to tell a joke. So before I get started on the more serious subject of colonisation, I was reminded when Andrew asked me how long this talk was going to take, that I'd had a similar talk from Rodney Hyde, who was a politician, if you remember him, in Auckland. He was also a lecturer at Lincoln University. And he started off one of his very first lectures by nervously tapping his papers, talking very fast, getting through to the end of his lecture notes and looking round desperately and disappearing out the door. And he stayed there because he discovered it was a broom cupboard. He stayed there for about 5 minutes, hoping that everybody had gone after he had gone, and then came out again. And there they all were looking at him because they knew it was a broom cupboard as well. What do you do? So he went through his whole thing again, only a little more slowly. So I'm hoping I'm not going to be doing what Rodney Hyde did, and I know it's locked as well. I've already tried that to see if there's an escape route. So back to the more serious topic of colonisation. So what does happen when a culture, a country, a state colonises a space? We all probably know, if we read Latin at school or learnt about Roman history, that when they colonised, and they did a lot of that in Europe, they invaded. But when British came to New Zealand, they thought that nobody actually lived there. The reports were it was called, in a Latin term, terra nullius. Nobody lives there. There were comments that there were savages here, but they weren't counted as people, and so the assumption is initially it's ours. The other things that are commonly undertaken are place name substitution. One of my colleagues who came from Israel said that was done when Palestine was part of it, was given to Israelis, and Israeli names were placed over Palestinian names, locations were changed. Local people are driven out, Indigenous are driven out. Colonial knowledge and values are substituted. So the place becomes a colony of those that have that culture, and others are in an invidious position of needing to change or not. Layout of towns and cities is imposed according to those colonial values. So, an example, perhaps, is that certainly cultures become disconnected in a place like this. It's very likely that communities are disconnected as well, but that is a consequence. The grid layout of the European city, in fact, yes, of European cities, but also transported by Spain to Latin America and South America, with piazzas, of course, instead of some of the designs that we have. But where can we see that in New Zealand? Well, I heard that Marcinborough is designed, the road layout, in the shape of the Union Jack. Now, what could be clearer than that? There are lots of different examples. The Roman roads, straight because they were built for armies to walk along, so straight and flat. Wellington, where I was born, was designed in the UK. And so they weren't aware of the topography. They didn't take into account the different latitude in the south, and so the houses often faced the wrong way because they were designed for sun in a different direction, and There are roads that actually go nowhere because the topography is too steep, so they turn into pathways up the hill. You will know of lots of different examples of those. So colonisation commenced, but what about the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840? Well, that was signed. The original instigation was so that the administering authorities would have the power to deal with the debauchery that was happening in Russell at the time, the sailors, drunken sailors. But afterwards, as Hardy Williams has told me, while the British betrayed Māori since the signing of the treaty, there are indications that equality is beginning to take shape. But what I strongly recommend to you, if you have not had much on the treaty and don't know very much about New Zealand's early history, what about reading Vincent O'Malley's book, The Great War for New Zealand? Great read. Strongly recommend it. But just another point on, so what happened next? In 1870, there was a Native Lands Fraud Prevention Bill, most interesting name. And the purpose of that was to bring the lands of North Island, which belonged to the Māoris, into a purchase system so that everybody could proceed with colonisation. This is what the Minister of Justice said about it. And the other great object was detribalisation, to destroy the principle of communism, which ran through the whole of Māori institutions. Oops, it's automatically changing now. I can't read fast enough. Maybe I need a boy to do some technical work on this. So, first of all, the Act to allow access to land, to address detribalisation, and finally to try to bring about assimilation. That was the purpose of one of these laws. And thank you to Na'aho, Desna Whanga Shalom, for these slides. So what are these strategies, these colonisation strategies? Well, there was introduction of subdivision, British land laws, British land system. Māori didn't have ownership of land at all. It was not owned, but it was there communally. So a recent innovation, maybe you've heard about it, is to do with Tūhoi, where Te Urewera is now not owned by anybody. Te Urewera owns itself, and I'm hopeful that others take opportunities like that. So detribalisation, land confiscation, British law brought in. Was there assimilation? Perhaps. But I've been working with elderly Māori recently, and some of the consequences are still reverberating. For instance, the Native Schools Act, Māori language forbidden in schools from 1867 onwards, and that was policed in education very severely. So the Māori language could not be spoken in schools, and often parents took the view that it was better to encourage their children to speak English than Māori. And so some of the very old Māori now aren't able to speak Māori, and it's a pain, a sorrow for them. And as far as healing, the Tohunga Suppression Act, 1907, to replace traditional healing with modern medicine. And that traditional healing, such as use of herbal remedies like rongoa, still used today, but at that time a lot of the knowledge was lost through the suppression of tohunga. So what remains today is very, very precious, the knowledge of use of plants, New Zealand native plants, for healing. So, have an idea of what might be done as far as colonisation. So it's all about culture and management and power and justice and so on. What about decolonisation? Well, here's some ideas. What could we possibly do? And I think you'll probably have much better ideas than I have. First of all, it's the knowing who we are and where we've come from. Because on the basis of that, we make all sorts of assumptions. And respecting different cultures and values and their languages, as the rugby commentator drew our attention to in the Herald. And what about our identities, our diverse identities? I'm proud of them and the range of them, rather than regarding Māori and Māori culture as entertainment, as the rugby guy also mentioned. So we need to question assumptions, we need to work with communities, share resources, and there should be a place for all in our cities. So in summary, the decolonisation, and Arama did ask what I was thinking of. It's actually about social justice and fairness. That's all I'm talking about. So, what about disciplines? And by disciplines I mean architecture, landscape architecture, engineering, design disciplines. There are, of course, others, design. Are they colonised as well? Well, I think so, because a number of them use European knowledge solely, based on. So how can we tease out those ideas? And my own profession of landscape architecture is possibly hit worse than others, because land is intricately bound into landscape architecture, and there's a number of terms that are not simply terms used in other cultures. For instance, landscape. It's a cultural construct, that is. It's relevant to a particular culture, maybe many cultures, but in this case, European cultures. It doesn't exist in Middle Eastern cultures. If you talk to somebody from Iran about landscape, it isn't a word that they use. And it's not a word that came from indigenous cultures either. There isn't a word landscape in Māori language, even though somebody did discover that it has made it to the online dictionary, Te Ara, but it wasn't used in the past. So cultures change, language changes, and we need to accept that that's exactly what happens, but recognise that if we're dealing with cultural constructs, there are particular ways of thinking that it leads us to. Nature's a cultural construct. I don't know whether people had understood that as well. So Chinese will think about nature in a different way to First Nations and Canada, in a different way from those who might be in Latin America. Thought of as a different way. It's a cultural construct, even though you might be able to measure the leaves of a tree and so on. Professional knowledge for landscape architects comes from the West, and cultural knowledge as well from the West, and they're enmeshed. So it's very difficult for landscape architects, and many have struggled with it, to tease out what are the values, the value propositions that come with the culture, and what is the skill, the learning, the professional expertise that we're learning at the same time. And I know architects are looking at that, others are looking and have dealt with it, but it's not easy. So taking this as a proposition, I was in the lucky position in that as a Secretary General and a President of International Federation of Landscape Architects, I travelled to a lot of countries. And so I thought, I wonder if this really is true or just in some of our minds. How does it all work out? So I spoke to Russians about it at a conference. I spoke to Japanese and Chinese about it, and also in Middle East. And how did they face it? How did different cultures face it? Those from China had a difficult time because they had welcomed a whole lot of different beliefs, cultural values and so on that had come from the West, and they were finding that their own cultural knowledge was being undervalued. That began to change. Particularly young students were objecting highly to what about our own culture, and gradually now China, instead of assuming that a landscape architect from Canada, America, Europe must be better than their own knowledge, they are changing and remembering that they've got 6,000 years, maybe more, of landscape understanding, nature understanding, planning cities even understanding, and that they should go back to their own ecology, their own culture, and work with that instead. And they instead are, I guess, repositioning some of the old values like feng shui as an ecological philosophy instead. So it can be done in different ways of thinking. Japan had just ignored the values that had come from the West, and so carried on. They had been designing as well gardens and cities for thousands of years, so simply let it wash past. So can deal with this in various ways. But how, in New Zealand, can landscape architects deal with it? Well, Māori landscape architects had a number of hui to think it through. They looked at a lot of the expressions, a lot of the principles and so on, and gradually a way forward was worked out. But initially the barrier was, do you do a checklist? How do you move from principles that are important for any culture to what actually happens on the ground? How do you apply different cultural understanding? But what seemed very clear for landscape architecture, for others, is it's about developing relationships. Recognising and responding to mana whenua, that is the people whose authority, whose respect, whose roots are with a particular area. It's about social justice and so on. And another story, one of our speakers at a conference just recently from Australia was explaining how difficult it was in Australia to contact their local Indigenous people. He happened to be from Melbourne, which is in Aboriginal terms, Naarm is their name for Melbourne City. The place was Naarm. And it so happened that although he said he'd been unable to contact anyone to get some feedback on a particular design he was working on, there was somebody from there, Aboriginal, from the very place sitting in the audience. They hadn't been talked to. But anyway, his view was that it was difficult in Australia, but New Zealanders were doing it very well, that landscape architects in New Zealand and New Zealand culture generally seem to be doing it a whole lot better, seem to understand the culture a whole lot better. And I was surprised that people clapped, because are we really? Is that what we want to believe? Are we in that position where we can clap ourselves? I really don't think so. So, what sort of things have been done? Well, last year, Dr. Becky Kittle and Victoria University had this idea that they would have a competition, and UNESCO provided funding for it, and they worked with the youth of Ngāti Toa Rangatira in Pururua and had a competition on imagining decolonised cities. They had 2 different sites in Pururua, a large scale, a small scale, and had both students and practitioners submit entries. But that was, for me, the first time I'd grappled with, so what is a decolonised city? How do you go about it? And what were the entries looking at? And in their view, decolonised cities are cities that are equitable places for all whānau, for all families, reflecting Māori values and identity. So it was the Pururua identity that was important for Māori as well as other New Zealanders. And the ideas that came from that, for Indigenous it was in place. And they wanted to see recognition of local names, local narratives, their environmental values, because Pururua Harbour is not in a great shape, and their waterways, and their cultural landscapes. And these were the ideas that were iterated with a group of kaumātua who I was talking with for a research project on Monday. They too would like to see Pururua City do something about that. They said it hadn't happened yet, that they were wanting more and more. But they were still swimming in Pururua Harbour despite the pollution, and they had many happy memories from their childhood of doing just that as well, and collecting shellfish from round about the edge of the harbour. So those are the memories that people hold, but does it take place today? So, next one. I thought, why don't we have a student design charrette with New Zealand Institute of Landscape Architects conference? But my hope was to have many different universities taking part, not solely landscape architects, so that this would be something where we could all work together, students work together from different ideas, different universities, different disciplines. And their project site was Onakiritea, Hobsonville Point, which has already been partly developed, nearly fully, and to look at what does it mean to design in a colonised land, a colonised city. In the end, we had about 8 different education providers taking part. We had 38 students, brave students. We had a PhD student in working on decolonising design. We had planning students from Otago. We had landscape architects from Lincoln. We had students from Victoria University, from Massey University, and we had one brave, thank you Auckland University, we had one brave architecture student as well from here. So those students were really challenged to look at their assumptions and see what it was that they, what were their hopes, but what were other people's hopes as well when they looked at how they might go about design. And we were asking them to look at it from a Māori lens as well. So the charrette took place at Te Noho Katahitanga. We had the full support of Whaia Linda and Jess Aranui and Papa Ho, who explained at night in the Wharenui what the po meant round the edge, and that actually is a full history lesson of ancient tribal links, of whakapapa, in other words, genealogy, but it also includes the changes that are happening in New Zealand and the changes that happened in Auckland, and right up to the end wall you can see is about development and about the volcanoes and so on in Auckland. So the students learnt about living together, which was a first for many of them. At the same time, we had lecturers who were from Balindongnunga. This is from Indigenous Australian, also Ngāti Porou, Rongamai Wahine, Ngāi Tahu and Kahununu. Different range of Māori information to present to them. The thing that we were most remiss about was that we didn't have mana whenua there. I don't know whether the word mana whenua is a new one for you, but it means the people of the land, and the people of Hobsonville Point, which we are looking at, are Kawarau Maki and Ngāti Whātua ki Kaipara. And neither of them were either to be there, able to be there. I quite understand. They were booked for months ahead, and we only changed to this site in the last couple of weeks before we held the meeting because of changes that were happening in the other sites that we had looked at initially. So they couldn't be there, and students needed to understand how it would be if they were seeking consultation from mana whenua, how they might gain an understanding of their values and what was important to them about the site. Also, what is a colonised city? How might you go about decolonising it? And so, what were the value propositions that they were working with? And again, this is an aho slide about design, material design, which is transient, and including Māori values with it to reinforce identity. And it's about identity for those who are in a colonised place. So, for any of you who have taken trips with students, this is the get on the bus, to go out to the area, they have the walk, they go around the site, and then do the work. One thing that a CHARRETTE is a project that happens very quickly, and I think probably all of you know what a CHARRETTE is anyway, but just in case, some of the culture of CHARRETTEs is that you do it overnight. You work all the way through the night, but I'm not as flexible as some and don't encourage working until the presentation is done by those who are standing sleeping. So they were back in the marae by 9:30 at night in their beds and working again the next time. I didn't ever see a student with a cell phone out during the day while they were working, so I think it was a success. So because a CHARRETTE, the outcome is not so much what is the great design, because it's not going to be necessarily very brilliant after only a limited time working on it. It's the learning about the topic and the learning to work together in a multi-university, multidisciplinary group. And so the presentations took part. The students listened intently. The one with the poncho on is the PhD in working on design. So she had different things to share with the student from architecture in Auckland and the Lincoln University students, and some layouts were produced and some different ideas came forward that talked of galleries and sharing of food and ways that might bring the new community at Hobsonville together with those that were there in the past and not living there now. We did ask how many Māori were living, but they're not there yet. And so using different knowledge as well. This is the 30-day Maramataka cycle. So part of culture is knowledge. This is trying to use other sorts of knowledge in what is being produced. And what was produced, they looked at the multiple histories of place, Māori, Air Force homes, and it was for the officers at Hobsonville Point for the Air Force Base next door, and now of course the new settlement, and new communities, use of food, learning art galleries as tools, and materials, local materials that were being used and could be better used as well. So what's another example? That was one that was already worked on, but Glen Innes is going through a process of change at the moment as well, and I've been working on a project there, looking at neighbourhood and place. And just recently, the local community held a project called Home Fires, which involved local youth from Tamaki College. It involved families and those that were living in the middle of a neighbourhood under vast change. Concrete mixers were going down the road regularly. There was the noise of power saws and drills and everything, and dust and dozers and diggers and everything else while people were living there. Very difficult situation, and it was being imposed on the community, or that's what many felt. So the Tamaki College students were asked to paint this wall about what they would like to see, what was their desirable suburb in Glen Innes, what would they like it to be, and then over the top of that, how they felt it was now. And so you didn't actually see what was their dreams, what their dreams were that was underneath, because instead what you saw were the words that they felt at the time, which are words like fear and anger and hurt. So that is what happens when vast change happens to people that perhaps are powerless to do anything else. And is there a place for the former residents of Glen Innes? Is it being just gentrified so that other people are living there, and can those that were there who are Pacifica, Māori, largest communities previously, and also Burmese and other new residents, is there a place for them in Glen Innes, or will they be moved out to the outer suburbs through inability to be able to pay the cost of housing in places like Glen Innes? And I've recently looked to a book that you're probably well aware of, Bettina Watson and Bentley, that talks about place identity and what we need to do to acknowledge histories and also recognise non-human aspects, which of course are the trees, the environment, the water, which Māori community are very anxious about the quality of the water that goes into the three harbours. So Glen Innes is still proceeding. But what do elderly Māori say about decolonisation and design? And in the work that I've been doing, we had several comments. One was that the land was so important in terms of well-being for them and for their health, the health of the people, that it wasn't just for Māori, it was for all people. And is there evidence that there's true application of Māori values in recreation areas? They didn't think so. They thought that they would become stagnant and stale. And this was talking about Auckland. The first was talking about elsewhere. And they thought that the open space should be green and vibrant with a rich combination of cultural elements as well. So the places should have meaning not only for Europeans, for others, but also for Māori, so that they're inclusive spaces. So, what have Auckland Council been doing? Well, one of the things that they've introduced are principles, te ARANGA design principles, which originally came through Ngā Aho, but have been adopted by the Auckland Design Office and are being worked with Mana Whenua so that they're grounded in Auckland with Mana Whenua rather than simply a set of principles that have come from elsewhere. And that's what needs to happen. So this is cut straight from the ADO website, as you might recognise. So I urge you to go and look at the te ARANGA design principles and work through them rather than me simply giving you a list of them. But the important part of it is that they're intended to explain how these principles can be applied on the ground to design on the ground. So, some final words, but before I come to that, I had a discussion with the colleagues that I was working with last week, and one said this, and I wanted you to know about it. Colonisation impacts are evident throughout the urban fabric of our cities, be it in the language of our wayfinding and signage, the built forms that tower through our cities, the narrative in the landscape, and the collective identity of the public realm. Many of our cities could be anywhere in Europe, and this contributes to the identity crisis our city have, not only for Māori, but for all New Zealanders. And of course, if you go overseas, you can follow plants that you find everywhere. You can look at high streets that have the same Starbucks, same shoe shop, same everything. You can walk down a street and wonder where you are. So where is identity? There's an international identity, an international plant palette that is high street everywhere. But on a spectrum of how far positioned we are as a society towards either a city planned on Eurocentric worldviews at the one end, or a city planned on Māori worldviews at the other end, our cities look, feel, represent, in Elena's terms, 90% Eurocentric planning, appearance and function. No one is saying that we want to be 90% in the other direction, well, yet, but we need to start to shift further along the line towards a 50-50 point. So we need to respect each other and find different ways of designing. The design professions are being pushed further and further to recognise equitable design for people of all abilities. You could look at cultural design and decolonisation in the same way, because we're largely looking at equality and equity. So, as well as being accessible for wheelchairs, what about accessible for all cultures? If our public realm wayfinding and signage is now going to be in Braille, shouldn't it also be in Te Reo, in Māori language? It would be if it was in Wales, in Welsh. If we're considering how public buildings are accessed and used by people in wheelchairs or with visual impairment, shouldn't we be looking at how they can be used for cultural purposes, such as pohiri or hui? And shouldn't we be designing homes and spaces for Māori as well as others. So that's thank you, Elena Renata. So, final word from her was recognition that the cultural overlay doesn't work for everybody. All places or all pockets of society. So why don't we start stripping back our cities to provide more culturally conscious placemaking that allows us to, as we always say, see our faces in our places. So, conclusions. We seem to be resistant to decolonisation. It's difficult. People have been talking about it for a while. We're not doing it. So can we change? What is it that is difficult? Is social equity a distant hope? Are connections to place through stories, names, culture, do they assist in city design and identity? And we need to design with humility and respect for homes and communities and cities, not houses. Houses instead of homes. So, acknowledgement of those that contributed to this. Ara honoury, thank you. And before I finish, I wanted to say again thank you to our Winston War Board sponsors. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you very much. We've probably got time for a couple of questions. I've got one to start with. It does seem that there's a moment of kind of accelerating change, like these are with the development, for example, of the ARANGA principles, and I know the NZIA's made a lot of moves in the last little while. I'm thinking 30 years from now, when we kind of look back, what do you think will be the kind of key, the most important things that are happening at the moment? Do you kind of have a sense of what's the really critical changes that we're either making or trying to make?
I've heard lots of people say, and this has been through a long time, we're at the crossroads. Yeah. We've been at the crossroads, different crossroads, lots of times. I don't think we are really there. But what's happening in Auckland is a lot of building. I'm hoping that when we start some of the building, and there's going to be 4,000 houses, for instance, built, the government announced, in the Unitec campus, on the balance of the Unitec campus land. I'm hoping that we will recognise the natural area that we have there, many native trees there, and the the spiritual water that is there, and the harakeke, the special flax areas and so on. In other words, I'm hoping that it will be much more jointly with community, with Māori values as well as other values, rather than just a rush to build houses as quickly as we can and as densely as we can. It's not necessarily the density, of course, it's the quality and what we think about. And so I hope there'll be more partnership with local mana whenua there, so that it is, as an example of other developments, it is done jointly so that people have places that they can identify with rather than simply more houses. But of course houses are needed as well, as you well know.
Are there any other questions?
It's a really interesting issue, isn't it? That Maori, in fact, Western never had cities. So we've got such a new ball game to try and fit that society into the current society, which is full of colonisation. And that's all not necessarily good.
Well, I would argue there. Māori have been living in Auckland for 1,000 years, for instance. They may not have been living in tower blocks, for instance. They did live densely. There were 7,000, I understand, living on Mangare Mountain around there. So did live densely, did live in populated And I think it's fair to say that Europeans didn't necessarily live in cities originally as well. So our cultures change, finding ways to make those transitions so that the values that each holds are recognised rather than simply say, well, there's no place for you because for now we're building a city and therefore it will be on a rectilinear approach and so on. There are different ways of doing it, and if we want to be designing something that is not seen elsewhere rather than the high street that we see everywhere, we need to think about what's special about us and what are the values that we can demonstrate that we've got.
Question?
Do you see a way that with this integration of these different cultures, there'll be a way that the social issues that have been picked up along the way will be addressed at the same time? So there's different issues that have arisen from maybe how we've been living or different, from your point of view, potentially colonial situations, which have caused social maladies in different communities, and then bring them back together.
Well,
the social issues are still there, whether
I see it about it is about social justice, I think, anyway. And so for those who have suffered a lot through family disintegration, through ill health,